Good evening. I'm Kate France.
And I'm Tabby Tyler. Tonight we talk about the do's and don'ts of historical preservation.
So grab a beverage. It's time for a night in.
So, my beverage after my hard day, plowing through social media and everything that's going on in the world these days is being finished off with a glass of mead.
Oh, friendly. Friendly.
As usual.
Friendly like the buzzy bee who made it. I'm having scotch, so.
Excellent.
I went from hating scotch to suddenly drinking single grain, not even aged, just you burn your throat as it goes down scotch. I don't know.
I really like that I'm drinking literally alcoholic honey. That's what this is. This is alcoholic honey, and you're drinking bougie antiseptic.
Yeah.
In terms of harshness.
It's true. It's true. I liked the pain. Or, the lack thereof.
I don't know if we could get more polar opposite in our beverage choices here. But
yeah, but we're going to need these drinks to talk about what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Which is a recurring theme with us, actually.
Yeah. We handle history, especially American history, with a glass of steadying booze in our hand.
Yeah.
But, it's got to get done. The conversation has to happen. But basically everything we're doing, everything in the world is being communicated right now, like you and I right now, through the internet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
That is how we're experiencing the world through each other's eyes. And, it's great in some respects because I'm getting so many points of view that people are just sharing so much information right now in their stories on Instagram, on Twitter, on TikTok. There's revolutionaries on TikTok. It's amazing. And so, I spend a lot of my time experiencing other people's stories on social media to try to gain new viewpoints. And I came across one, and I sent you the Yahoo News article on it. But Jill Scott shared her experience as a Black woman touring a plantation. And it was extremely uncomfortable to watch, as it should be, because she was extremely uncomfortable experiencing it, and from our point of view, it makes sense that she's uncomfortable, and it's kind of jarring that there are people out there who don't understand this, but essentially she is touring this plantation in the South, and she is being given this detailed tour about the carpets and the furniture and what everyone was doing in these rooms and what the experiences were like and how these parties were. And, there's a giant glaring hole in the Southern experience pre-Civil War that's not being spoken of, and you can see on her face how traumatic it is that she is basically being gaslit by a version of history.
Yeah.
And it really hit home for me that that's a portion of the trauma that today's Black Americans experience, is that there is a portion of their ancestral trauma, of the just abject suffering that their ancestors experienced, that is, the attempt is being made to kind of just push that to the side and pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah, you said earlier, that portion of history, it's like she's being gaslit. And it's kind of like, what are you talking about? That never happened. You're crazy. You're equal now. Things are fine,
Yeah. Yeah, like, come on, this plantation's a bed and breakfast now. Like, literally a bed and breakfast.
Yeah,
they turned it into a bed and breakfast.
You said she was offered the slave quarters, which is,
right,
totally
but they've been
appropriate.
Yeah, they've been remodeled. They're beautiful. It's fine. And it's like, no, that is so far from fine.
Yeah, and what she says in the video, she's like, by the way, I think we didn't say it, but this is an Instagram video. But what she says in the video is, like, you wouldn't stay at Auschwitz. Are you kidding?
Yeah. Yeah. You would never turn Auschwitz into a bed and breakfast. And it's like, it shows in that statement, because it's true. These places were work death camps for Black enslaved people. It shows how far our version of taught history has gone from reality, that sentence is jarring, that you could turn this place into a bed and breakfast and have it be
and again,
acceptable.
Like the myth of the chivalrous South, because that's what this is, right? Has been perpetuated throughout our education system, even to today. You and I were talking earlier, and you had said that in school, when you learned about slavery, you focused on, this slave had a great life.
Yeah. There was this weird emphasis on, but some slaves were fine. Some slaves were
and
treated
me,
great.
I don't mean to say slave. I mean to say enslaved person.
Well, in this case, we're quoting our teachers at the time, who, first of all, called these enslaved people slaves, which dehumanizes them, first of all. So we're not even being taught about these people as people. And then secondarily, we're being told that it's like, but it's fine, because some of them didn't suffer quite as much as others, which is such a bizarre philosophy to ingrain in children's minds.
Yeah, but there's a precedent for this. I want to bring up basically the post-Civil War era, where when historians in the South started writing about the South, they embraced this concept, this romanticized concept of the chivalrous South. And historiography became hagiography, and they started writing about the South as if it was like this saintly, beautiful place, and the relationships between master and slave was maybe more like, benevolent father, right?
Yeah. And projecting some weird paternal fantasy upon an enslaved person, and they're essentially like hostage taker is just horrifying.
But what's interesting about this is that the North allowed this to happen. There was an absolute demand for the creation of a national unity after the Civil War between the North and the South, that it became something that was allowed to happen. And then fast forward to the Daughters of the Confederacy writing the history books that students look at probably even to this day in some states, that just romanticized the antebellum period in the South.
And you see this really reflected in, I hate generalizing on ages, but it's very much in boomers and Gen Xers, Gen Xers, who are so reluctant to accept a more realistic history as truth. There is an article we referenced several episodes back, Dear Disgruntled White Plantation Visitor by Michael Twitty, and he describes people's reactions to, he's a historical interpreter. He basically presents history as it stands. He's a Black gentleman, and he presents the history of his ancestors through food. He's a chef, through the food that they cooked at the time, and through the work they did at the time. And so he presents this to plantation visitors, and their responses are usually dismissive or almost degrading, because they just aren't accepting of his presentation as truth as much as they perceive it to be sort of an extremist version of history.
Well, I mean, they're there to see the grandiose nature of plantations. They want to see the big dining rooms, the furniture, the carpets, the
Greek columns.
yeah, all that nonsense. And so they don't want to be told about slavery. They don't want to feel guilty, as it were. And he says that sometimes when he talks about slavery, people say, ugh, like, can you just show us the house, or can you just not,
Yeah, could you just not? And it's they don't want the illusion, the fantasy disrupted, but I do think there's an element of, you go through at least 12 grades of public schooling where you're told a much prettier version, and then this one man is giving you a very different, much more accurate version, much more violent version, where your fantasy is disrupted. And there is a certain level of, I guess, I don't know if it's propaganda, but the programming that you've been taught from this kind of education makes you kind of go, that doesn't seem right. No, you're making a big thing out of nothing.
But that becomes such a barrier to progress. I mean, we have two examples here. One plantation where there's a more realistic depiction of what happened. Another plantation that's not realistic at all. And people kind of indicate, they signal that they want to see the not realistic, just really pretty version. And so there's like a financial impetus to show the paying customers what they want to see, which ultimately becomes like a barrier to portraying history in a truthful way. And then again, we're talking about the education system right now and how your programming works against you, which is, again, ultimately a barrier to progress.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't expect someone like Mr. Twitty to somehow undo a lifetime's education in, the 30 minutes he has with this person. And, he works at a really great plantation where they do handle all angles of it, and he's traveled the world and been able to give these stories of his ancestors and really honor what they went through. And so there is a right way to do it, and there is an audience for it. And I think we are moving into an era where this history is going to be taught, whether people like it or not. But there is that other side, that resistance, and that fantasy and that bubble that has to be burst.
Sure.
I think that's
that
just
is very clearly like a don't of historical preservation.
Oh, for sure. And historical preservation, when you embark on that mission, you do have a sort of honor-bound agreement to preserve an accurate form of history and not just revise it and put a pretty white supremacy bow on the top of it and be like, it's fine now. And so they do have that responsibility.
Yeah. We wanted to talk about, Did you have another thought there?
No.
No, okay, yeah. We wanted to talk about kind of historical preservation in two different ways. We talked about it in regard to plantations and how they've managed to preserve the building itself. That's all I'm going to say in regard to that. It's like, okay, so you're preserving...
Yeah, they've managed to really preserve those Greek columns.
You sure did. Yeah. But there's still definitely improvements in some of them that can be made in regard to the historical narrative. Something else interesting that we've touched on in previous conversations between each other is
Kate and I talk a lot.
We do, yeah.
So we're referencing constantly conversations that all of you are not privy to. But believe it or not, this is what we talk about all the time.
Yeah, it is. Historical preservation of like neighborhoods and historic buildings and old cities and this and that. And basically it's like not just the preservation of plantations that have a negative impact on Black communities.
districts and neighborhoods, historic districts, just preserving them is a way of pushing a narrative one way or another.
Yeah, depending on how it goes. Like, for a small little history lesson, there was a big movement of affluent white people into the burbs, like early 20th century. And then at some point in like the 60s, 70s, there became these movements to take back the city. Now, take back the city is kind of interesting. When they went to the burbs, the working class remained behind in the cities. And so the old town cities kind of became the neighborhoods of minority groups. And the take back the city movements, where the affluent urban suburban residents moved back into the cities, coincidentally, they had a tendency to displace the working class that was living there. The Back to the City movements also sometimes were historical preservation movements, where old 1800s row houses were, taken into the hands again of the affluent community, generally the white community. And this revitalization often had a very destabilizing effect on low-income residents. In the 60s, the sociologist Ruth Glass used the word gentrification to describe the influx of middle-class individuals into working-class communities.
And gentrification is a really hot-button word right now. And because it does disproportionately affect people of color, specifically Black people, because systematically the working class is also disproportionately Black or, people of color. And so when this kind of thing happens, they do tend to be displaced. Their businesses, small businesses, get displaced. And so, it's one of the many systemic things that really need to be addressed in this country.
Mm-hmm. Wait, I'm sorry. I actually lost you because my internet is bad.
Oh.
You were probably hanging on the edge for me to respond.
I was like, and she'll have a thought. No, I was saying that, gentrification is a really hot button word, because it does displace disproportionately Black people and people of color, and their businesses. There's, small businesses, burgeoning small local economies can get decimated through
and
movements of gentrification.
Broad changes would be like the change in the character of the neighborhood, the change in the identity of the neighborhood, loss of diversity, lack of affordable housing suddenly, decrease in multifamily housing.
You've got really big conflicts between traditional old residents and new residents.
Mm-hmm.
Or the loss of residential units through converting
into
Yeah, exactly.
Well, there was this book that you and I were referencing when we were doing this reading. It was called The Living City, and you guys will just have to, forgive me, because I don't know when it was written exactly, but I think it was written in, the 70s or 80s, I think. A quote from it, though, is, "Gentrification is primarily a problem in those neighborhoods where public policy abets accelerated speculation, does little to assist in-place residents to stay, and in fact encourages the new investor with a variety of incentives, but provides no encouragement for in-place residents to stay," end quote.
Now, speculation in this frame is referring to speculative building or speculative development, which is essentially purchasing a lot or a property and building or retrofitting a space without having a buyer in mind. Mm-hmm. You'll see this a lot, or you may have seen this a lot in the early aughts, the early 2000s, when, people would put up these big old condominiums and in the middle of a city and not actually have any homeowners in mind. And a lot of builders do this. But just like in the early 2000s, it can lead to a lot of empty spaces because it's essentially a gamble. You're buying this space, this property, when prices are low with the intention of making a profit and selling at a higher price. So you do have a tendency to put up an apartment building and not have any tenants for years even.
I think, though, like, in regard to gentrification, though, there probably is more of, like, a targeted buyer. Like, let's say you're trying to take back a historic district, right? And you know that maybe there is motivation within, like, the affluent community to buy into that area. Then you have accelerated speculation with the hope that all of these affluent people are going to come in and take over the area.
Oh, for sure. And generally speaking, though, that, like you're saying, the speculative interest in this area is not the people who live there.
Yes.
You know what
exactly,
I mean? Like,
exactly.
And so that's an important aspect of this, is that when gentrification is done in this way, there's a lack of interest and investment in both the community that it exists and the people that live there.
Sure, yeah, because you basically get to a point where, like, the city doesn't see any inherent value in that community and doesn't see any benefit to investing in and benefiting the people who live there. Like the quote says, they don't give them any assistance or encouragement to stay. And I think the results are pretty obvious. I mean, it forces people out. But I guess it's pretty myopic, the leaders in policy who desire for this to happen, because, like, the people who are displaced out of the community, they don't disappear, they just move somewhere else, which ultimately, you know, causes a lot more disruption, you know.
Yeah, destabilization
is the word I really meant. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, because you've got people uprooted from their lives because they can no longer afford a place that they have, you know, grown roots, and are expected to find a place to live now. And, you know, migrations of people are disruptive, and it doesn't allow for growth.
Yeah.
This is another one of those systemic things that doesn't allow, minority communities to really thrive in a lot of ways.
Gentrification, and ultimately gentrification doesn't help solve a community problem. Like,
for sure,
it's an imbalance between the rich and the poor, and low-income communities aren't viewed as assets, and you just have basically a recipe for disaster. Again, like, it's a matter of, like, looking at the working class and saying we need to invest in this community, and we could probably create more inherent value within our own, you know, city, community,
for
whatever.
Sure. And it can be done well. It can be done in such a way. And then that was kind of what this book really taught me, was that it really can be done well. It's been done well in several different cities.
Sure, yeah.
And it just takes time and research and...
Well, and then speaking of the idea of a community or a city recognizing, like, a certain community as an asset rather than a problem is, for example, Savannah, Georgia, I think it was in the 70s, there was this big push to preserve the Victorian District, right? Mm-hmm. Without actually gentrifying the district. And that was basically pioneered by Lee Adler, who had a lot of experience in restoring old town Savannah, like the old downtown Savannah. Basically, once all of that was rebuilt, all of the historians and preservationists are looking around for more property.
They need another fix
to preserve, yeah. And
we gotta preserve more.
They kind of, like, honed in on the Victorian district, but Lee Adler was very forward-thinking, and he didn't want to create destabilization by basically kicking all of the working class people out of the Victorian district. He just saw the ability to fix it and preserve it and add it as an asset to the city. And Savannah has one of the biggest tourist industries, you know, in the state.
Yeah.
But their method, his method and his society's method, was to buy property from absentee landlords. Because a lot of the people living they were slums. The Victorian District was a slum. And a lot of the people living in the slums didn't own the property. They just rented from
They were renting.
people who don't live there. An absentee landlord is somebody who owns the building or the property, but doesn't actually live there or have any like active management involved in, maintaining it. And so it quickly became a very slummy area. Another thing that I kind of realized when I was doing the research for the show was that absentee landlords don't really have an incentive to maintain a property, because if you allow it to become pretty much like garbage, right, the property value is less and then your taxes are less.
So the less work they put into their property, the less it's worth, and the less they have to pay ultimately in taxes.
Yeah. So, like, buy property from absentee landlords, and they did this through public and private funding. He renovated hundreds of homes, and then he rented them back to the working class at 30% the cost of the rent, and then the rest of the rent was covered by federal subsidies.
That's awesome. And so this was primarily the same demographic that lived in the area, or the same people and tenants that lived in the area
I think I lost
prior.
you, Tabby.
And this was primarily the same tenants and demographic that lived there originally, correct?
Yes, exactly. Sorry, I'm having kind of some technical difficulty. I can hear you now, but I lost you before, so no worries. We'll keep moving on there.
I will bear with you.
You know what? I hear 8 o'clock, like 7:30, 8 o'clock is the worst time, because it's everybody coast to coast is on the internet right now, and apparently it just causes a lot of traffic in the web.
No, we've met the highways traffic jam, the internet's traffic jam.
We certainly have, yeah. But thank you for going along with us, intrepid listeners.
And so it's interesting because Lee Adler really took inspiration from a couple different cities that had done it successfully prior to this, Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. And Cincinnati was really interesting to me because they basically, the city council assigned a board of a group to, look into renovating this section of the city called Mount Auburn. And ultimately, it galvanized this group of 8 people into creating a nonprofit. They got $7,000 from a investor, a former Cincinnatian, and they started doing the same thing. They bought absentee-owned homes. 75% of the homes in Mount Auburn were absentee-owned. Isn't that insane?
That is insane.
Like that's the majority of the community. Is not all rental property by the community. Yeah. And so, they ultimately sold these properties to people committed to restoring them, or turned them into tenant cooperatives.
Yeah.
And tenant cooperatives are really cool. They were more popular, and I think they're better. They kept control of the property within the community, and you didn't have to worry about somebody who could ultimately be more in favor of
because you have people who are invested in the community, and it also creates like a community equity.
Yeah. And to the point where they had a like sort of motto that was renovate, not relocate. And I really liked that. They galvanized the community. They helped them invest in their own properties. They helped these properties become their own properties, first of all. And it gives this community that already has a sense of community, that already has a sense of identity, real ownership and real agency.
Sure, and real leverage too. I mean, they took that $7,000 investment and leveraged it into a $9 million nonprofit organization.
Which, especially in 1967 when they started, that's a lot of money.
Sure, yeah. Yeah.
And so, that it shows it can be done.
Sure, yeah. I mean, those are definitely the how-tos.
And and it shows time after time. The Living City showed that it was ultimately for the city cheaper to reinvest, to renovate, not relocate, and, really embrace what they had rather than bulldozing and gentrifying.
Sure.
Which I think is great. And the thing that I really took away from this, though, is that when you read the book, when you read Lee Adler's methods, and you read what happened in Cincinnati and Philadelphia, each community had a slightly different approach. Mm-hmm. They had to be original because every community is different, and you can't do some kind of nationwide gentrification program and expect it to succeed. You've got to work with what the community has, and ultimately to, I think, a better result.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, they all were very innovative. Lee Adler was a very affluent individual who had the ability to leverage policy and gain money from, his community and also, the government, ultimately through like public funding. And then you look at like the Cincinnati community where they were not affluent people. They were community members, and they just used the investment in their own town. So anyway, yeah, I mean, there's no federal overarching method to solve the problems of disenfranchisement, lack of equity, gentrification, things like that. It ultimately becomes a community-run approach.
Yeah, and, my local representative, Omari Hardy, who I've now mentioned 3 episodes in a row, he got on Instagram Live and really talked about how racism in our neighborhood, in our city, is really reflected in policy. And I think that if we really want to change our policy, if we really want to, influence change and invest in our community, we kind of have to do as he was suggesting and really make sure that the policies, the rules in place, and the city are all reflective of our desires and indicate that we want to reinvest in the community and and we have to kind of divorce ourselves from these ultimately systemically racist policies like redlining, which has very much led to kind of an incidental segregation here, and as well as zoning issues, zoning laws.
Yeah, and briefly describe what redlining is.
So essentially, redlining is the denial of services by the federal government or local governments to selective groups of people. Primarily, it's racially motivated, and so redlining in this way was generally about mortgages, about lending. Mortgages, lending, city loans, things like that were denied Black people in certain areas, and that by default created segregation.
Sure, and it forced them to live in certain areas.
Exactly. It created quote unquote Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods because you just you were less likely to get a loan or a mortgage for an address in certain neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't be provided services in certain neighborhoods, to go so far as like ambulances and police services for Black people in certain neighborhoods. And some of this was implicitly stated and some of it was implied. But this created people living in neighborhoods where they knew that they would be able to exist peacefully. You're gonna go to the neighborhood where if you have a heart attack you can get an ambulance, and you're also gonna live in a place where you can actually get a mortgage. So if we want to really have a more diverse neighborhood, if we really want to have a city reflective of these values, then we have to disassemble the policies that are still in place today that uphold redlining and things like that in a roundabout way. You know, they don't say on paper anymore, hey, you know, don't give a mortgage to a black guy in this zip code, but the philosophy that put it in place is still there.
Wait, you know what I'm hearing?
The dog, my kid, everything.
No. What I'm hearing is that it's important that we vote in our local governments.
Oh, yeah. No, that is literally the point of, I think, every episode leading to November from us.
Thank you for listening to this whole show. This is actually our plug for voting. You got to vote.
Yeah. You didn't know it, but we work for Rock the Vote. And
yeah, right.
This is all just a really long ad. They couldn't get real celebrities this year because of COVID, so it's us.
Yeah. No, but I think ultimately that's the thing, though. It's like, so if you want to stop, like, the city developers abetting accelerated speculation, if you want to stop the practice of, like, redlining, you have to vote for people who are going to have the best interests in mind of, like, working class communities. I mean, gentrification is real nice. It makes an area look real pretty, but, like, it doesn't actually solve any underlying problems.
And societally, it is toxic.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Because, once again, it is putting down those who are the least paid and appreciated by society.
Yeah.
And so, on that happy note,
I
do
heard,
something about it.
I heard your dog.
Get out there.
I heard your baby. I heard your husband. It sounds like your world is very busy. So.
Oh yes, it is. So this mead will go unfinished.
No, it's going to go finished right now. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Chug. All right, now I can handle anything.
Mm-hmm.
The elixir of the gods.
Tyler and France do not condone drinking in any way. Do not condone alcoholism and irresponsible drinking.
No. All right.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful evening.
Hey, you too.
Thank you so much.
You too.
I'm going to go put a baby to bed.
Bye.
Bye.